Okay, hopefully you came up with some reasons why edge might not always be a good thing. And so let's talk about these different groups of species and how they rely on edge. We have what are called edge associates, edge specialists, and forest interior species. So what do you suppose the difference is between those three groups? Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. Edge associates means that you like to have access to resources in two or more vegetation patches. So they're associated with edges. Now, that's a term that you should become familiar with, associates, much like the term obligate. But the word obligate, remember, that means that you're highly dependent upon whatever you're obligate to. So edge associate, the word associate, is not quite as drastic as the word obligate. Then we have the edge specialist, and this might be more like an edge obligate. They are likely to occur only in edge type habitats. And then you have your forest interior species, and it doesn't have to be necessarily forest. You might have grassland interior species where they don't want to be anywhere but in the very center of that larger habitat type. So these are your edge avoiders. So let's kind of think about it as edge associates, edge specialists, and edge avoiders. Then you have the animals whose home range includes edge, but they don't need it. So they're kind of neutral. They may be there, they may not. They could care less one way or the other. So let's look at some examples. Here on the y-axis, we have species richness going up, so the overall number of different species occurring on the landscape. And on the x-axis, we're going from like a grassland core, like a grassland-dominated ecosystem to a forest-dominated ecosystem. So over here, we have fairly low species richness of just grassland core species. But we also have some associated grassland species. So those that might occur on the interior, but they may also occur on the edge. Then you get farther here toward the middle and you get forest and grassland edge associates. So you get where those two habitat types are coming together. You get an increase in abundance of those different species. Your grassland associates are starting to drop off because you're getting less and less grassland. You no longer have those core species, but now your forest associate species are starting to pick up. And because you have the overlap of the grassland associates, the forest associates, and the forest grassland edge associate, your overall number of species has gone up right here in this edge habitat. So that's the edge effect. Your diversity, or rather your richness of species, is going to be higher in these areas because of that overlap. And then you push toward that forest interior and you get the forest core and forest associates, but your overall species richness has dropped down because you don't have as many different species occurring. So let's look at some specific examples. Here are some different bird species. First, we have the red-eyed vireo, which you can see on these graphs. You have area of forest, so the farther to the right you get, the larger patch of just forest type, solid forest without edge you get. And so you see that on here we have the probability of occurrence. So when you have a small forest patch, the probability of occurrence of the red-eyed vireo is low. And when you have a large forest patch, the probability of occurrence is very high. You have a similar story here with the scarlet tanager. As you get into the forest, you're more likely to find them. Wood thrush and ovenbird all have these same trends. So what kind of species do you think they are? Are they edge associates? Are they forest associates, or edge avoiders? Let's just take a look at our options here again, right? We have edge associates, edge specialists, and edge avoiders. So which do you think these are? Hopefully you said they're edge avoiders, right? They're the ones that are going to not do as well and not be as many in the areas associated with edge. Let's look at some more examples. Here's the indigo bunting, not a bird we have out here, but I wish we did. It's a very pretty bird. And you can see as you get into the larger forest patch, their probability of occurrence actually declines. So what kind of species do you suppose that is? Hopefully you said edge associate, right? They're going to rely on having resources in two or more patches. And then we get this guy. What type of species would the eastern wood pewee be? They don't seem to have any trend lines up or down as you get farther into the forest. So they're probably an edge neutral species where it doesn't really matter if they have edge or not. So you get a variety of species, and I'll tell you what, birds are a really good group of animals to study when you're looking at the impacts of edge. So why do some species not like edge? I want to talk for a minute about what's called the microclimate. And we've mentioned this here and there throughout class. You may have heard me mention this, but a microclimate is the area on the landscape that might be slightly different. Its climate might have some very slight differences from the larger area around it. And it might be in the area that impacts that particular animal. So here we're looking at the variable of light intensity, how bright it is. Well, it doesn't take much to think about that as you go deeper into the forest, it's darker, right? It's not as light, but you may not have really thought about how that might impact an animal. Animals are sensitive to light. Some of them want to be more secluded and out in that darker forest. So we see a difference, and this is two different habitat types. An oak woodland surrounded by grassland, or an oak woodland surrounded by chaparral. And chaparral would be like a small shrubby kind of plant, so a little bit more cover than a grassland. And you can see it's fairly the same trend line, but you do get a little bit more light coming in with the grassland. Let's look at the microclimate change of temperature, right? We have temperature and distance from edge. So the farther in you get from the edge, you see that the temperatures actually drop a little bit. And again, looking at it surrounded by two different habitat types. So a forest or an oak woodland surrounded by grassland and chaparral, we see that as we get farther in, our temperature, especially in that area that was surrounded by chaparral, drops significantly. This is looking at relative humidity. Here's your area next to edge. Here's farther interior. Why would humidity actually go up as you get deeper into the woodland? Well, heat has a lot to do with it, and sunlight has a lot to do with it. So it's really the inverse of those former two graphs that I showed you. Your humidity is actually going to be different. So these little microclimate differences are one reason why species might avoid edge. Okay, so those microclimate differences matter. We know that there are some small differences that occur on those edge. Here are some other reasons why animals might avoid the edge. You have more disturbance, maybe more wind throw, maybe the intensity of a disturbance is higher, maybe there's more humans traveling through the area or animals grazing, feral animals occurring. By the way, feral animals are animals that were once domesticated, at least their species was, and now they are wild, and they're usually detrimental to the larger wildlife population. Okay, so let's look at the amount of edge and the size of edge, the seventh concept here, that's in one successional stage. So some animals need large unbroken areas in that one successional stage, whether that's grassland or forest or shrublands. They just want that large unbroken habitat. And so how do you manage those species that need larger areas of unchanging habitat with those that want the edge? So generally, if you can have unbroken blocks between 10 and 40 acres, that makes a good balance for both the edge species and the interior species. Let's look at how geometry matters and how we break these same area up into different size chunks. If I have a 10-acre plot of land here, I have an edge of 1,265 meters around the perimeter. If I take that same 10 hectares and I put it into two 5-hectare chunks, my total edge is 1,789 meters. If I take that same 10 and I put it into 5 2-hectare chunks, my total edge goes up by yet another 1,000 meters. So you can see that we can have the same total area of habitat and a lot more edge or a lot less edge depending on how that habitat is arranged. So it's really important to think about when you're managing habitat. You can have all the available habitat in the world, but if it is arranged in such a way that there's too much or too little edge for the species that you're managing, you may not get the results that you were hoping for. So here's a question. Would forest interior species benefit from having A, fewer large patches, B, fewer small patches, or C, fewer medium patches? So we're looking at forest interior species. What do you think? Well, if you have fewer large patches, that means that you're probably going to have quite a few smaller patches. And so if you're an interior species, you probably don't want those smaller patches. So we're probably going to say that B, fewer smaller patches, would benefit an interior species. So yeah, we are right. Forest interior species benefit from having fewer small patches. Your edge associates, though, will benefit from having more or fewer large patches, more smaller patches. And then shape matters. So you get that length of edge per unit area, or what is the density of edge for one area that you're looking at. So here's a variety of shapes, and you can see the circle is the most efficient. You have more interior space with the least amount of edge. Or if you take the same area and you make it all zigzaggy wiggly, you're going to get a ton of edge for the same interior area. So 2,000, this is probably meters, versus 1,000 meters with the same area. Okay, and the last thing to consider with the geometry is the arrangement. If you have like chessboard type patches, you're going to have little square blocks, and that will minimize edge. And when we're traditional forest management practices went in and cut out a square of trees for a clear cut. And now we're getting a little bit better about trying to make more natural lines and not so stark, contrastingly square patches, and that is both for aesthetics and for the idea of having maybe more edge in an area. You might have the pattern of where cuts occur in a forested stand and have a systematic, square harvested out every 300 acres or something, and now, or you could have it be more staggered and maybe a little bit more natural looking. Okay, this last concept here, well, I don't know if it's last, we're getting close, is the corridor concept. We've already talked a lot about that when we talked about habitat connectivity, so I don't feel like I need to go into a whole lot of detail here. But again, thinking about how do these different habitat patches connect to each other and whether or not they can be beneficial for animals. This is particularly important in urban areas, and it's one thing I think the city of Fort Collins and Larimer County even has really been cognizant of as they plan natural areas and choosing which pieces of land they're going to purchase. This is a map of the city of Fort Collins natural areas, and in green you can see the areas owned by the city. They do own a lot of land here right up next to the foothills, and then this is Spring Creek and this is the Poudre River, and you'll notice that we have a lot of natural areas along that river corridor. The rivers provide a natural corridor anyway, so the more little habitat pieces that they can purchase up can increase the connectivity. But you still see that there are patches throughout here that, even though they might be a sizable chunk of habitat, really are not connected to other pieces at all, and therefore you can ask yourself how effective they are for benefiting wildlife. Okay, we're going to pause it here, and our very last video will look at habitat types in Colorado and the major threats that are associated with those habitat types.